Welcome, everybody. Just going to give everyone about a minute or so just to join us, and then we will get started shortly. All right, seems like everybody is almost in. We'll give it about 10 more seconds, and then we will start. All right, seems to be slowing down. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining this evening. So appreciate your taking the time. I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group, and I hope the information I'm going to present to you tonight is helpful. Before I dive in, just a couple of quick logistical things. The first one is we are recording this. We'll try to get the link to the recording out to you tomorrow or on Thursday. But I am going to cover a lot of ground tonight in a relatively short amount of time. So please don't feel like you have to hang on my every word here. I'll obviously feel flattered if you do. But the real goal tonight is just at a high level that you have a better understanding and a little bit of context in terms of the standardized testing landscape and how they're used in the college admission process. Also, feel free to share the link to the recording. If you have friends or colleagues who you think might be interested in this, definitely feel free to share that link with them. Also, if you have any questions as I'm going through the information tonight, definitely feel free to type the questions in the Q&A box or Q&A tab that you see on the screen. Just in the interest of time, I'll hold questions to the end, but I'll keep an eye on the time, try to keep us moving tonight. But definitely don't be shy. Don't hold back. Feel free to type any questions that you have. But three major goals for the presentation tonight. The first one, again, is really just to give you some context for these tests. These tests are not the be all end all of the college admission process. Your students' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. Having said that, I don't want us to completely put our heads in the sand either around these tests because depending on the schools that ultimately end up on your students' list, there are schools out there that will see the scores, consider the scores, put a little bit of weight on those scores. But anything we can do to keep these tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. Second goal tonight is, as the title suggests, we'll just do a deeper dive on the ACT and the SAT, just so you have a better understanding in terms of what these tests now look like and a better understanding of some of the differences between them. And then third goal tonight, I'm just going to end by talking about a testing plan at a high level. I'll give you some general guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about your student standardized testing plan. All right, so with that as a quick intro, let's dive in here. So I start with this slide. I start here because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. And what we're looking at here is just some of the different factors that are going to go into that final admission decision. And the main take home message that I want you to have from this slide is please keep in mind that the number one thing that college admission officers are looking at is a student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. Next thing they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear this referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at their high school? And then for those schools that look at or consider standardized testing scores, the two major tests are SAT or ACT. Colleges accept both these tests equally. So really at the end of the day, it's up to your student to decide if they want to focus on or go down an SAT path or if they want to go down an ACT path. Also, if your students in AP classes and taking AP exams in May and chooses to submit those scores as part of their application, those college admission officers will see those scores, consider those scores as well in that overall application read. But not to depress all of us, but for those schools that are getting, for instance, like 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 plus applications now, they are reading the student essays that are part of those applications. They absolutely are reading your students' counselor recommendations and teacher recommendations. They are looking at your students' extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they've had, any work experience they may have had, and all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through the college process for the first time, the term you'll hear around this process is what's called the holistic review. And what the college admission officers are doing with this holistic review is they're really trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's grades or GPA and put it in some kind of formula with their SAT or ACT scores and then make that admission decision based on that number. With this holistic review, all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And I do just want to take a minute just to talk about the test optional school landscape, just so you have a better understanding in terms of kind of what it looks like for our students, and what it means in terms of their applications. Now, I'll start by saying I know that there are a number of schools that have gone back to requiring standardized testing. And when these schools made these announcements that they were going to go back to requiring standardized testing, they did get a lot of press and publicity for that decision. But please keep in mind that we're still at roughly about 80 to 85% of colleges and universities have continued their test optional policies. So we can say with a high degree of confidence, whether your student's a ninth grader, a 10th grader, an 11th grader, they absolutely are still going to be applying in this test optional environment and ultimately have a number of test optional schools on their list. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some schools that have gone back to requiring. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does give you a feel for the type of schools that have gone back. So this is where we find like the Harvards of the world, the Dartmouths of the world, the Stanfords of the world. Also, if your students looking at some of the larger state schools, particularly in the South, like University of Florida, University of Georgia, University of Texas at Austin, for instance, they've also all gone back to requiring standardized testing. But knowing that there's going to be a number of schools on your students list in that fall of senior year that are test optional, I really encourage students to see these tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit. It's just one more objective data point that they can potentially share with colleges, knowing if they choose to, but knowing they're going to be in control of their scores to a number of schools on their list. I really encourage students to see these tests with that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Because what test optional means is kind of as the name implies, is that students are in control of their standardized testing scores. So they ultimately decide whether they want to submit those scores as part of their application or not. So just in the fall of senior year, they're looking at their SAT or ACT scores. They feel good about those scores. They feel like those scores are reflective of the work they've been doing day in and day out in school. They feel like those scores will be supportive of their application. Even though they're applying to a test optional school, by all means, they'll include those scores. Those college admission officers will see those scores, consider those scores in that overall application read. But just if for whatever reason, right? Those scores came back a little bit lower than what that student was hoping for or expecting, just really not reflective of what they're capable of academically. They are not obligated to send that score to that test optional school. That college admission officer is not going to see that score. Most importantly, that college admission officer is not going to try to guess in terms of what that score may have been. They don't have time for that. So if your student applies to a test optional school without standardized testing scores, what that college admission officer is probably going to do, a little bit of a deeper dive on those grades, on that transcript, on that rigor, just to reassure themselves that that student can handle the rigors of that particular college or university. And again, knowing that there's going to be a number of test optional schools on your students list and knowing they're going to be in control of those scores, that's kind of where I want students to view these tests with that kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Now, there are some caveats to the test optional landscape just to be aware of. The first one is if your student's looking at some of those more or most selective test optional colleges, and I'm thinking about kind of like the Duke universities of the world or the University of Chicago's, for instance, we are seeing the percent of students applying to these type of schools with standardized testing scores is starting to tick back up. Also, if your student happens to be a recruited athlete and getting recruited by a coach from a test optional school, depending on the school, depending on the sport, depending on the league, even possibly depending on the coach, we are still hearing from some college coaches that they are asking for standardized testing scores as part of the recruitment process. And I think the reason for that it's just those colleges and universities want to ensure that their college coaches are recruiting student athletes that meet a certain academic standard or threshold. So standardized testing scores might be part of what they are asking for as part of the recruitment process. But if your student's getting recruited from a test optional school, they can always just check in with the coach. They can always just ask them, like, hey, am I going to need standardized testing scores as part of this recruitment process? The coach will be able to tell them, yes, they'll need them or no, they won't need them. And then if they do need them, the coach also should be able to give the students a range. They should be able to give them an idea of in terms of kind of where they're hoping that score will ultimately come in. And then the third caveat around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of a merit scholarship award. So, what a merit scholarship award is generally a non-need based financial aid award. So, for those schools that give merit scholarships, they're using it as a recruitment tool. So, they are trying to entice strong students to apply and hopefully ultimately enroll at their institution. Now, the reason why I talk about merit scholarships here under this kind of test optional umbrella is just be aware that there are schools out there that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit scholarship awards, they might still be factoring in standardized testing scores. Now, the college admission offices, they try to be as transparent in their policies as they can be. So if your student's applying to a test optional school that you know gives merit scholarship awards, you can always just ask them, do they consider standardized testing scores in those awards or not? And they'll give you an honest answer in terms of what their policies are. And then the last point that I want to make around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of strategic submission. So, what strategic submission means is let's say, for instance, in the fall of senior year, your student has 8 test optional schools on their list. With strategic submission, your student doesn't have to decide, okay, I'm going to submit my scores to all 8 of my test optional schools or to none of those schools. They can actually decide on a school by school basis whether to submit those scores or not. So in our hypothetical example here, they might ultimately decide, you know what? I feel good about my scores to these 6 test optional schools on my list, so I'm going to go ahead and send those scores. But maybe for whatever reason, I'm going to hold my scores back from these 2 test optional schools on my list. And you can see kind of pre-pandemic, only about 4% of students nationally kind of knew about this and were taking advantage of it and were classified as strategic submitters. Then, with COVID and the pandemic and almost all schools going test optional, you can see this percentage went up sixfold. Next time this survey is done, I think we're going to be well over kind of 60-70% of students nationally being characterized as strategic submitters, just as more and more students nationally and families learn or know about strategic submission and are taking advantage of it. But this idea of strategic submission, it does dovetail nicely with that philosophy that I want students to have in terms of looking at these tests through that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Not only are students in control of their scores to their test optional schools, but with strategic submission, they are in control of those scores on that school by school basis. And again, I'm going to hit you with a lot of information tonight in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation tonight, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering three pretty straightforward questions. Which tests should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if your student has this testing plan mapped out ahead of time, it's just going to reduce some of the anxiety that always seems to surround standardized testing. Just students knowing when they need to be thinking about these tests and when they need to have them on their radar can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that stress. And I'll come back to these points around the testing plan, but I do want to make them now. The first one is I know that there is huge pressure on our students for just early and often testing, right? Just keep testing, 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 and start that process earlier, earlier, and earlier. But please keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So everything that students are doing and learning day in and day out in school is helping them prepare for these tests. So what that means is statistically speaking, most students are going to peak on these tests kind of later in spring of junior year, even into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take these tests, that's when I want them to take them. And then the second point around the testing plan is at the end of the day, that quote, perfect testing plan is going to be customized for your student. So it really is what's going to work best for them and what works best for you as a family. So please do not worry. If your testing plan ends up looking a little bit different than what a best friend is doing, or what a neighbor is doing, or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing, there's many paths to success here. It's really what's going to work best for them. All right, so now as we start doing a deeper dive in terms of what the standardized testing landscape now looks like, I'm going to start by talking about this newer digital adaptive PSAT and SAT. So the PSAT and the SAT, they have moved to an online test. So it is no longer a paper and pencil test. And I will say that our students are totally in their element taking an online test. Like they are not fazed by this at all. But for students to take the official PSAT or an official SAT, they need to download the Blue Book app. So that's the testing platform that the College Board uses. So they use the Blue Book app for the PSAT. They use it for the SAT. They actually use it for AP exams as well. So when students download the Blue Book app, in addition to taking the official tests, when they sign into the app with their College Board account, they also have access to full-length practice tests. So I think the SAT has now released 8 or 9 full-length adaptive SAT tests. There's two online PSAT tests that students also have available to them. So for students who want to do some self-study, that is a great resource for them. Here at Summit, we've developed 4 adaptive SAT tests, so definitely feel free to reach out to us to take advantage of those as well. And I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through the testing platform, like what it actually looks like for students to take these tests online. And I will say, the College Board, they put a lot of time and effort into developing the Blue Book app. It's a pretty user-friendly testing experience for our students when they take these tests. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking you through the platform. Here we are looking at the verbal side of the test, but just to give you a feel for some of the features that the students have access to. So on the verbal side, they do have access to this annotate button here. So when they click on it, it's going to give them a highlighter so they can highlight parts of a passage. It also brings up an annotation box. So just if they want to take notes on it. And the SAT still very much multiple choice test. So on the verbal side, all of the questions are multiple choice. On the math side, almost all of them are. There are some free response questions on the math, but anytime students are taking a multiple choice test, we know process of elimination is a very useful and helpful strategy. So in the platform, they've built in this strikeout button here. So that just enables students to cross out wrong answers as they're working their way through questions. If they change their mind and they want to uncross out an answer and bring it back, they obviously can do that as well. The other nice feature that the platform has is it has this mark for review button. So let's say a student's 50-50 on a question and they know if they have time in that section, they want to come back to this section. They can mark it for review because then when students come down here where it says question 1 of 27, if they click on this tab, what that's going to bring up is a dashboard of every single question in that section. So at a glance, students can easily see every question that they've answered, any question that they've skipped, and any question that they've marked for review. So even though it's an online test, it is very easy for students to navigate from question to question throughout the test. There's also a built-in timer, which is kind of nice, so students know exactly how much time they have left in that section. For those students who are like, Drew, you got to be kidding me. Like, this is the last thing I want to see is like this timer ticking down on me as I'm working my way through this section. Students can hide the timer. They can unhide it so they can bring it back so they know exactly how much time they have left in that section. But this is what it looks like on the verbal side for the PSAT and the SAT. This is what it looks like on the math side. Very, very similar features that we saw on the verbal. So here's our answer eliminator. Here's our mark for review. Here's our dashboard tab down here. Here's our timer. But the other nice feature that the Blue Book app has on the math sections is it has this calculator icon. And students have access to this calculator icon on every single math question that they're going to see on both the PSAT and the SAT. And when students click on this icon, what that's going to bring up is a Desmos graphing calculator. And for those of you who are familiar with Desmos, you know that it is a very powerful graphing calculator tool. So if students have some familiarity with Desmos and some comfort level using it, it can be very helpful in terms of answering some of the math questions that they're going to see on this test. Having said that, students can absolutely bring in their own graphing calculator as well and use that in addition to the Desmos calculator or in lieu of that Desmos calculator. And it is an online test. So on the math sections, students are given scratch paper. So they're not expected to do everything in their head or do everything on their calculator. They absolutely can write things down on that scratch paper, and we highly encourage students to take advantage of that. But this is what it looks like on the math side. So I do just want to take a minute as we start doing a deeper dive on the testing landscape, just to talk about the PSAT. So the PSAT, it really is just practice for that SAT. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make any admission decisions based on PSAT scores. Anytime students get an opportunity to take an official test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice for them. And I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through the scoring of the PSAT because it can lead to a little bit of confusion. But the online adaptive SAT, it's still on the 200 to 800 point scale. So 200 to 800 on verbal, 200 to 800 on math. But as you can see, the PSAT, it is on a 160 to 760 scale. So for our juniors who end up taking the PSAT NMSQT in the fall of junior year, and the NMSQT, that just stands for National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. It's a very competitive competition. It's less than 1% of students nationally who are going to be named a National Merit semifinalist or finalist. But it is another reason why I encourage students to take the PSAT. because, it does open them up to be eligible for that national merit scholarship. But the PSAT, and again, in terms of the scoring, it is on a 160 to 760 scale. So when our juniors get their scores, PSAT scores back, and they realize that it's out of 760 instead of out of 800, often the question we'll get is, all right, Drew, so does that just mean I can add 40 points to my PSAT verbal score and 40 points to my PSAT math score, and that would be my SAT score? And you can kind of tell by the tone of my voice and the way in which I'm talking about this, but the answer to that is unfortunately no, they cannot. And the reason for that is you can kind of get a sense for this, the way this slide is organized, but these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score your student would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if they got a 600 on the PSAT verbal and a 600 on the PSAT math, that 1200 would be their SAT score. The reason why the PSAT is kind of cut off at 760 instead of out of 800, this is in some ways the College Board acknowledging that students are taking this test a little bit early. So they're taking it in October of junior year. Again, they're not going to peak on this until late spring of junior year, possibly even into that fall of senior year. So those hardest math questions, for instance, that are in that 760 to 800 point range that are on the SAT, they are just not on the PSAT. So that's why the score is cut off at 760. Similarly, on the other end of the scale, in this 160 to 200 point range, there's some easier questions on the PSAT that just aren't on the SAT. But again, with that vertical alignment in their scoring, you can still use your PSAT score as that baseline score for the SAT. But when our juniors get their PSAT scores back, depending on when students take it in October, typically they're going to get it back kind of early November to mid-November. But I always tell students not to worry or not to panic if that PSAT score came back a little bit lower than what they were hoping for or what they were expecting. Where students start on a PSAT and where they ultimately end up on an SAT or even an ACT later in their spring of junior year or that fall of senior year is often two very different places. But it does give students a baseline score. It does give them a general sense in terms of kind of where they're starting on that process. All right, again, the two major tests, though, that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT or the ACT. Colleges do accept both tests equally. They do not see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. Again, they accept them both equally. So really, at the end of the day, it's up to your student to decide whether they want to go down an SAT path or whether they want to go down an ACT path. And here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests just to give you a feel in terms of what these tests now look like. And I will say there is some overlap in terms of content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test, just harder reading on that SAT, trickier questions. There's just more misdirection on that SAT, trying to make things seem harder than it actually is. Whereas the ACT, the reading's a little bit easier. The questions are a little bit more straightforward, but the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. So students who take an ACT, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, often they'll walk out of there and be like, Drew, you know what? I actually didn't think the ACT was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. So on the SAT, we already talked about this, but in terms of its scoring, 200 to 800 on what I'm going to call verbal, 200 to 800 on the math. So it's still on that 400 to 1600 point scale. If you're not familiar with the ACT, its structure takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's divided up into an English section. This is the grammar portion of the test. Then there's a math section. Then there's a reading section. Don't get thrown off by this word science here, this science section. It's not what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's really more of a scavenger hunt than anything. Students are given scientific passages. They might not know anything about that science topic. And really, what they're being asked to do is can they find the information in those scientific passages to answer the questions that they are being asked? Now, the reason why the science section here is in orange is one of the recent changes that the ACT made to their test to try to compete with the shorter digital SAT. So the SAT, when it went to this digital adaptive format, it's a much shorter test now. So the previous iteration of the SAT, the paper and pencil test, was a 3-hour test. But with the adaptive format of this newer test, it's now down to 2 hours and 14 minutes. And the ACT very much interested in kind of competing with the shorter SAT test. So one of the ways in which the ACT is trying to shorten their test is by making this science section optional. Now, having said that, even though it is optional, our our recommendation is if your student ends up going down the ACT path, that they take the ACT science at least once. That way they have a score if they need it. Because depending on the colleges that end up on your students' list, even depending on specific majors or programs, there are still colleges out there, even though it's a small number, that are still asking for or looking for that science score. And here in the Northeast, probably the number one school that falls on this list is Boston University. Even though BU is test optional, if your student applies to BU and submits an ACT score, they will only look at or consider that score if it includes that science section. So that's where that recommendation for us comes from. It's more of a hedge than anything. I'd rather have students have a science score and ultimately maybe not need it than take the ACT without science, and then maybe in fall of senior year, they apply to a school or a program that's looking for that science score, and now maybe they're scrambling just to take the ACT one more time, just for the sake of getting that science score. So that's where that recommendation comes from. You can see on the ACT, it also has this optional writing at the end. Our general recommendation for students on the optional writing is if students go down the ACT path to register for the ACT without the writing. The colleges, they're really not looking for that writing score. They're not putting any weight on it. So we advise our students, if they go down the ACT path, to go ahead, register for the science at least once when you're taking it, but don't worry about registering for the ACT with that writing score. Again, you're not going to need it. Colleges aren't looking at it. If you're not familiar with the scoring of the ACT, it is on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges will see is they will see the individual subsection scores, and then they'll also see an overall composite score. Now, with the science being optional, that overall composite score is just the average of the English, math, and reading scores. If a student takes the ACT with the science, it is a standalone score. It is a separate score that colleges can see if they're interested in that science score, but is not averaged in with the English, math, and reading scores for that overall composite. Again, it is just a standalone score. All right, so I've talked about or mentioned a couple times how the SAT and the PSAT, they have this adaptive scoring structure now. So I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through this scoring structure, just so you have a better understanding in terms of how this works. So at the 30,000 foot view, when I talk about an adaptive test, what I mean by that is how students perform on an earlier part of the test, predicts their overall scoring range, and then the questions that they see later in that test are being used to hone in or refine that student's actual score. So before I walk you through this, let me just go back to this slide here just to orient us. So on the SAT, for both the verbal and the math, it's divided up into two what I'm going to call modules. So module one on the reading and writing, then module two on the reading and writing, and then module one on the math, and then module two on the math. And what students are going to see in that first module is think of this as being like a heat map of level of difficulty of questions. But in that first module, and this is true of the reading and writing and also the math, in that first module, they're going to get easy questions. They're going to get some middle level questions. They're going to get some hard questions. They're going to get some of the hardest questions on this test. And then, depending on how well students do in that first module, the test is going to send them to one of two second modules. So let's say a student did quote well in that first module. And by doing well, we think it means answering about 60 to 65% of the questions correctly. But so they don't need to be perfect on that first module. But if that's how that student's performed, when they've completed that first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And what the test has figured out is based on that student's performance is that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range. But the test doesn't know where in that range that student is. Is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or even an 800 level student? So to figure out where that student lies in that range, in this harder module, kind of as the name implies, what students are going to get is they're going to get hard questions, some harder questions, some of the hardest questions on this test to figure out where in that range that student is. Let's say a student struggled with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, when they've completed the first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And based on that performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is in the 200 to low 600 point range. And in this easier module, again, as the name implies, to figure out where in that range that student actually is, students are going to get easy questions. It's mostly going to be middle level questions. It might be a hard question or two, again, to figure out where in that range that student is. But just note, if a student ends up in this easier second module, their score is going to be capped. So we think the highest score that that student can get is somewhere in the 620 to 630 range. Now, going into the PSAT and going into the SAT, students know it has this adaptive scoring structure, but our general advice to them is don't worry about it. So when students go to the second module, even though the test obviously knows which second module that student was sent to, the test is not going to tell them. So students aren't going to know if they're in the harder module or if they're in that easier second module. And I just don't want students wasting any mental energy trying to guess which second module they got sent to. I'd rather they just kind of stay in the moment, just work their way through the questions that are in front of them, answer as many of those questions as they can correctly, because that's how they're going to maximize their score. Also, on the PSAT score report that you get back, it's also not going to say whether your student got sent to the harder module or the easier module. On the official SAT score report you get back, if your student goes down the SAT path, and the score report that you might ultimately send on to colleges, it's also not going to say whether students went to the harder module or the easier module, because as you can see, there is some overlap in scoring between these two modules, especially in that 450 to low 600 point range. So let's say a student got a 550 on the SAT math. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the harder module. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the easier module. It does not matter. A 550 is a 550, regardless of which second module that student went to. But it's because of this adaptive structure that the SAT was able to shorten their test, again, going from a 3-hour test to a 2-hour and 14-minute test, but still have a valid test and still keep it on that same 200 to 800 point scale. Now, the ACT is is still very much a paper and pencil test. It does not have this adaptive scoring structure. Talking to the ACT folk, it does not look like anytime soon they're going to move to an adaptive test. So just another kind of important difference between these two tests. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show you some sample questions from the SAT and from the ACT. Again, just to give you a better feel for how that power of the SAT differs from that speed of the ACT. Do not worry. I'm not actually going to call on any of you to answer any of these questions. We're not actually going to work our way through these. This is just more for illustrative purposes. Again, just so you get a feel for the differences in the types of questions that students are going to see on this test. So when the SAT moved to this adaptive format, the other major change that they made is they redefined what a passage is. So on the verbal side, the passages are no longer like these really long essays that students need to fight their way through. They're much shorter now, generally a paragraph or two. And then there is one question per passage. But just because the passages got shorter, it doesn't mean that the reading got easier. It's still a power test, still requires a close reading, analytical reading, almost a line by line reading of this passage in order to be able to answer this question. But here's an example of a writing question or a grammar question from the SAT. For the ACT, the grammar is tested through that first section, that ACT English section, just much longer passages on the ACT. And really what the assignment is as students are working their way through these passages, they have to correct their grammatical errors as they come across them. ACT reading, again, just a little bit easier, a little bit more straightforward. For the ACT English section, the passages, it's more of like a peer editing assignment. They're trying to write passages that mimic what a typical high school student might write. It just doesn't require that kind of close, deep line by line reading that SAT reading passage is going to require. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. Students only have 35 minutes to get through this entire ACT English section. So for the SAT, in addition to grammar questions, there's also reading comprehension questions. Again, much shorter passages, but here's an excerpt from a 19th century British novel that students need to fight their way through. On the ACT, the passages are considerably longer. So just to give you a feel for this passage is about a third. What I'm showing you on the slide, it's about a third of what the actual passage is. It didn't fit on the slide. And again, just to give you a feel for how fast-paced the ACT reading section is, students are given 4 passages, 9 questions per passage, so 36 questions in total, but students only have 40 minutes to get through this. So again, almost a total sprint from start to finish on that. But because of the fast-paced nature of the ACT, more questions along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the central argument that author was trying to make? It doesn't require that close reading, deep reading, analytical reading that SAT passage is going to require. Which then brings us to everyone's favorite topic on this test, the math. And I choose these 2 examples. They're both about slope of the line because, again, I think they do a nice job of highlighting that difference between that power of the SAT with that speed of the ACT. And you can see the SAT question on the screen. I'm not going to read it to you, but most students kind of have the same reaction that we all have when they encounter an SAT problem like this. And usually their reaction is something like, Drew, like what on earth? Like, I have no idea. Like, I have no idea what this question is even asking me, let alone trying to figure out how to solve it. So the SAT, they could have asked this in a much more straightforward way. They could have just simply said, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would read that and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the misdirection comes in. For students to figure out that this is all this question is asking, they have to figure out this whole A plus B equals zero and A doesn't equal B and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT, just way less interested in playing that misdirection game, much more straightforward of a question. Students are given two lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3. What's the slope of that perpendicular line? Now, you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes or you don't. If you do remember it, you know it's C, -1/3. If you don't remember that, you're kind of just choosing your favorite ACT letter here and moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no trying to figure out what that question is actually asking you. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between that speed of the ACT with that power on that SAT. Which then brings us to the optional science section. Again, our general recommendation is if students go down the ACT path is to take the ACT with the science at least once. That way they have a science score if they need it. And I will say the ACT science section, it is designed to kind of overwhelm students. Most students who encounter it the first time, usually their reaction is like, Drew, there's just no way. There's no way I'm going to be able to answer 40 science related questions that refers back to figures and graphs that looks something like this in 40 minutes. It's not actually as bad as it seems. Like I literally have no idea what a lithosphere is. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. And this is what I mean when I say the ACT science is more of a scavenger hunt than anything. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between. So really what it's asking me is kind of, can I find the outer core? And I know the outer core is here. So I know I'm between these two dashed lines. And then I know how to read a graph. So I know I'm on the y-axis here. I know I'm between these 2 points here. So I know that answer choice is C. 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students can struggle with the ACT. Because it's such a fast-paced test, it has the tendency of turning on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? Now, if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or even quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also about building up a student's confidence that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and move on to that next question. So again, there is some overlap in terms of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. With the SAT being more of a power test, more challenging questions, more challenging reading, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math on the SAT, which has a huge emphasis on algebra. So roughly 80% of the math is algebra 1 and algebra 2. Less than 10% is geometry, but more time per question. Whereas the ACT being more of a speed test, reading and questions a little bit more straightforward, does require that instant recognition though, as we saw with that ACT science question and that ACT slope of the line question. Broader scope of skills, especially on the math, were only about 30% is algebra, so way more geometry on that ACT compared to the SAT. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it, almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. Which then brings us to the $1,000,000 question. And the $1,000,000 question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew. So we know colleges accept both tests equally. So just earlier on in this process, if we can decide, right, are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? It's just taking that potential amount of work and cutting it in half. But which test should we focus on? Should we go SAT? Should we go ACT? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT. This type of student's going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both tests, ideally in a practice setting. So that way students aren't faced with the pressures of taking these tests for real. And here at Summit, we run proctored practice tests every weekend, both Saturday and Sunday, year round, out of our Waltham, Massachusetts office. We also run them out of our New Canaan, Connecticut office, but we can also arrange for students to take them at home. So depending on where you are, if coming into our office is not convenient for you, still definitely reach out to us because your students can take it at home. So definitely use us as a resource. I highly encourage you to reach out to us to schedule practice SAT and ACT because it is a great first step in this process. And then there is a concordance table so we can compare a practice SAT to a practice ACT. Here's the concordance table just to give you a feel for how SAT and ACT scores compare to one another. I know this slide is a little bit small, so just to orient us, 24 out of 36 is the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT, and then 30 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Keep in mind, roughly 70 to 80% of students who try both tests are going to score equally well on both. So often the decision whether to go down an SAT path or to go down an ACT path, it can come down to a student's gut instinct a little bit. Like we joke with them, like, which one did you kind of hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which test do you think plays to your strengths? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time getting a score that's more reflective of what you're doing day in and day out in school? And I'll also say with our practice tests, in addition to getting scores back, you also get an itemized score report that shows every single question your student answered correctly, every single question that they missed. So with that information, oftentimes, even though the scores come back equally, when we do a deeper dive on those customized or on those itemized score reports, often we'll have a recommendation based on kind of what we're seeing and the types of questions that students are answering correctly and what they're missing, whether we feel an SAT or an ACT might be the better path. All right, that next part of the testing plan, just when should students take these tests? So here's when the tests are offered. So as you can see, with the exception of January, they are now offered every single month. A couple years ago, ACT added a testing date in July, SAT added a testing date in August. So like, hooray. Your students can test over the summer now if they would like to, but we cannot stress this enough. Please do not have this be your student standardized testing plan. Like, no one wants students to take these tests like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It's just too much. They have better things to do with their time. Also, keep in mind that the scores do not just keep going up and up and up and up and up every time a student takes the test. At a certain point, we're going to see those scores plateau. At a later point, we can actually see these tests scores start to drop because burnout on these tests is real. Most students aren't one and done just because the first time they take the test, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that early fall of senior year, if needed. And we just talked about this, but a little bit earlier on in the process, if we can decide, right, are we going down an ACT path or are we going down an SAT path? We're just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ACT to SAT and then rinse, lather, repeat on that in that early fall of senior year. So we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something along these lines. And keep in mind, this is just a sample plan. Your student's actual testing plan is going to be customized for them. So do not worry if it looks a little bit different than this. But this student came to us after sophomore year, so over the summer, tried to practice SAT and practice ACT, scored equally well on both tests, but had a slight preference for the SAT. So we ended up going down the SAT path. She took her PSAT in October of junior year, and then we targeted March for her first attempt, June of junior year, June for her second attempt. She is in AP classes and taking AP exams in May, so just wanted to build that into her timeline. And then early fall of senior year for her third and final attempt, if needed. If you end up going down the ACT path, again, it might look similar. Practice tests after sophomore year, kind of late spring or over this summer. And then if you go down the ACT path, it might look like first attempt in April of junior year, second attempt in June of junior year, again, AP exams in May if applicable, and then early fall of senior year for that third and final attempt. Now, recruited athletes or strong test takers, we might push this timeline up a little bit, but generally when we push the timeline up, we're kind of targeting late fall, so November or December, for that first attempt for either the SAT or the ACT. I just want students to get into junior year a little bit, get get that learning under their belt before they start taking an official test. But if you go down an ACT path, it might look something like this. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, maybe something along these lines on the SAT side, maybe something along these lines on the ACT path. All right, in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to talk about superscoring, just so you're familiar with this term. So almost all colleges superscore the SAT. So what that means is if your student's taken the SAT more than once, what they will do is they will send in their score reports from 2 administrations of their test that leads to their highest super score. So in this case, the student would send in their score report from May and their score report from August, because what those colleges are going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though the student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on their SAT, for those colleges that superscore, and again, almost all do, that 1290 is going to be that student's SAT score. Now, a couple of reasons why colleges are superscoring. The first one is you have to keep in mind that college admission officers, they do read applications supportively, and superscoring's one way in which they can look at the standardized testing piece in that most supportive light. The other reason why colleges are superscoring, we all kind of loathe the US News and World Report college rankings, but published SAT and ACT scores still factor into those rankings. So it is in a college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can, and superscoring is one way in which they can do that. And let me just reassure you, for those colleges that are superscoring, they are in fact superscoring. They're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more score reports so they can see the 580 reading and writing, see the 640. They're not going to ask themselves which one's the real one. Should we average them together? They are going to take that 640 each and every time because it's in their best interest to do so. Now, colleges also superscore the ACT. That works the exact same way. This student took February and June of junior year, and then early fall, September of senior year. And same story. What those colleges are going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite. So even though a student did not get a 32 in a single sitting on their ACT, for those colleges that superscore the ACT, that 32 is going to be that student's ACT score. Now, with the science section being optional, the science is no longer factored into that overall composite score or into that super score. That is solely a standalone score that colleges can see if they are interested in that science score. Okay, third part of that testing plan, just how and when should students prepare for these tests? Just as I want students to do something sane and sensible on the testing side, I also want students to do something sane and sensible on any test prep that they might do. So, depending on their starting score and their ultimate goal score, most students are looking at about 6 to 15 weeks of study and practice going into that first official test date. I don't want students prepping for these things for like a year, year and a half, 2 years. Again, it's just too much. They have better things to do with their time. And in terms of what goes into the prep, three major areas. And our test prep programs obviously are designed around this as well. But the three major areas are content. So knowing what's on the test, right? So knowing all the grammar rules, knowing all the math that's covered. The other is strategy, just a game plan for every section and every question that they're going to see. And then full length practice tests is a great way for students to build up their stamina, get their pacing down, and also get more comfortable with the type of questions that they are going to see on those tests. And again, it's not a full length practice test every single weekend leading up to the test. Students are totally going to burn out on that. For our programs, we usually recommend that students try it 2 or 3 times going into that first initial test, just kind of first practice test as a baseline score. Then we kind of do another practice test kind of midway through the program. And then roughly about 2 or 3 weeks before the official test, just one more full length practice test, just to give them one more kind of full length dress rehearsal going into that test. And again, I know I covered a lot of ground tonight. So just to sum up what we talked about. So again, whether your student's a ninth grader, a 10th grader, or an 11th grader, we can say with a high degree of confidence that they are going to have a number of test optional schools on their list. So knowing that, really encouraging students to view these tests with that kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. We just talked about this, but earlier on in the process, our general recommendation is over the summer after sophomore year, reach out to us, take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT. We get a baseline score, but more importantly, it helps us choose a path, right? Are we going down an SAT path? Are we going down an ACT path? And again, many schools on your final list will be test optional. You'll be able to take advantage of that strategic submission so you can decide on a school by school basis whether to submit those scores or not. And then I just leave you with this. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. I really want students to view them as a chance to show off a little bit. It's another objective data point that they can potentially share with colleges to showcase their kind of college readiness. And again, I'm Drew from Summit. If you're not familiar with us, definitely reach out, take advantage of our practice SAT and ACT tests. As you can tell, we love talking shop. We love working with students and families and guiding you in whatever way we can and being helpful in whatever way we can in terms of helping you kind of pick a path and also setting up that testing plan for you. And then as you get into it a little bit, we do one-on-one tutoring, both in-home and online test prep. We do academic tutoring as well. We also do one-on-one AP tutoring also, if that's something that potentially you're looking for a little bit of support. All right, so we definitely have some time for questions here. As I'm pulling up the questions, I am just gonna launch a quick poll here. Um, just obviously you can reach out to us at any time, but if you would like one of our program directors to proactively reach out to you directly, definitely feel free to fill out this poll, and I will make sure that one of our program directors reaches out to you ASAP. Again, you can always just call us or you can email us as well. But definitely, if you're interested, feel free to fill out that poll. All right, let me bring up the questions. I feel like maybe one or two came in as I was talking. And again, we have some time, so don't hold back if you have any questions. Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying on this. Yeah, so someone was at a college fair, and one of the BU reps was there. And this is the BU in terms of the ACT science section. They've been, especially because they're test optional. So this is a question they've been getting. It's like, you're test optional. Do you really care that much about the science section that you're requiring it? So it does seem like they're going to move off of that off of that recommendation. So again, as this plays out with the ACT science, we might come off this recommendation in terms of having students, encouraging students to take it. I will say when the writing first went optional, we also made that recommendation again as a hedge in terms of encouraging students to take the writing so they had a score if they needed it. But now we've completely come off that recommendation. It's been very clear that colleges aren't interested in that writing. So we definitely tell our students and families, don't worry with taking with the ACT with that science. So again, we might come off that recommendation similarly for the science section, but we're not quite there yet. So that's still where we're kind of holding that recommendation to take it once. That way you have a science score if you need it. Let's see. So do we offer SAT or ACT group classes? Yes, so we do. We generally run them for the December SAT and the ACT. Those classes do meet online. We also offer them, I believe, for the May, March, potentially in May SAT. We offer it for I believe we offer it for the April ACT. And then we also run them over the summer, especially for our rising seniors, for those August SAT test date, again, for our rising seniors, and for the September ACT test date. But yes, definitely reach out to us if you're interested in group classes, because we do offer those as well. That's open to everybody, in addition to our one-on-one tutoring. So thank you for asking that. Let's see. Any other questions here? And thanks again for the clarification on BU with that science. Appreciate that. Let's see. Anything else? And it's totally fine if you don't. I know I hit you with a lot tonight. Again, we'll try to get the recording out to you tomorrow or on Thursday. So again, feel free to share the link to that recording. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions here, but thanks so much again, everybody, for joining us. So appreciate your taking the time. I hope this was helpful for you, and definitely please don't hesitate to use us as a resource. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you need anything. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. So appreciate your taking the time, and enjoy the rest of your evening. All right. Take care, everybody.